Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another literature review. As you can tell from the title, it's another Stephen King related one. It is for one of his more famous novels, Misery. This is my hardcover edition of it. And I have to say, it definitely has one of my favorite author photos from any of the Stephen King novels I own. That one, give you guys a better look at it. I just love the expression on his face, and the mustache looks nice on him. It looks like he's about to start telling the story like, "I'm about to tell you something that's about to scare the pants off you." And then you contrast that with his performance in Creepshow. You got the two ends of the spectrum with King as a person. He's going to scare the pants off you, and then he'll make you laugh. Misery, most people who haven't read the book know it from the 1990 adaptation directed by Rob Reiner, starring James Caan and Kathy Bates in her Oscar-winning performance as Annie Wilkes. And to date, this is the only Stephen King film to win an Academy Award. And when you watch that film, you see that Bates really does deserve that Oscar. He never got out of the cock-a-doodle car! Now, I will say that it is a very faithful movie to this. There's one subplot that's original to the movie that's not in here, but I'll probably mention that in kind of later in the video. If there's one thing it does a disservice to, is that since it is a visual medium, we lose one aspect of the novel, and that is the whole thing about drug addiction. Because it's in there. The movie kind of glosses over it a little bit. It could be there, but it'd be subtext. And that's in the scenes where Caan's character, you can tell he's really suffering from not having his pills. You could also see that maybe he's also suffering some withdrawals from the Norville not being given to him. But like I said, it's subtext. Here, that's the backbone of the novel, but I'll get to that in due time. Now, this is something that I stumbled across when doing a little bit of research for this, and I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but I'm going to mention it. From what I've read, it seems that part of King's inspiration for this novel was initial fan reactions to another book he wrote, The Eyes of the Dragon, which is a high fantasy book. And of course, even now, but more so in the 80s when he was at the peak of his popularity, King was mainly known for horror, which if you look at his first couple of books, you can see why. Carrie, The Shining, and Salem's Lot all in a row. All horror books. Different levels of horror, but all horror. So, he got typecast, but in a good way, kind of. But it was to the point that if he did anything that did not even have aspects of horror in it, he might get a rejection. And that one was typical fantasy. Now, I haven't read it yet, so I can't state for certain whether there were other reasons fans might not have enjoyed it as much. But it being fantasy has me scratching my head a little bit, because Eyes of the Dragon was published after The Dark Tower. You know, the Gunslinger. And this was right before he published The Drawing of the Three. Now, those ones also have other leanings in addition to the fantasy. There's the post-apocalyptic nature, along with a little bit of horror, but it's more subtle. And it's more... And the fantasy isn't like high fantasy with elves and knights and all that. Well, the Gunslingers are kind of like knights, but, you know, it's a post-apocalyptic Western fantasy, where instead of a high fantasy like Eyes of the Dragon is. So I could see the fans rejecting it. And King's like, well, I'm going to break out of that. And in the book, a reaction like that is personified in the character of Annie Wilkes. And of course, Sheldon's just sitting there like, oh crap. Now, before I get to the next part, I gotta talk about the plot for those of you who don't know. The plot is that Paul Sheldon is the writer of successful romance novels, focusing around the character of Misery. So there's a double meaning to the title there. Now, he has just finished writing the series, and he just finished work on another book that he was writing called Fast Cars. And he was driving home from his hotel after drinking a bottle of champagne and starting another, and he gets into a car wreck in the middle of a snowstorm. Annie Wilkes, his self-proclaimed #1 fan, happens to live in the town where he crashes. She drags him out of the vehicle and takes him home, does not tell anyone. And she, being a former nurse, she gets him back to health, but things are all not right in the head. And she almost loses him a couple times while he's like drifting in and out of consciousness. And when he awakens, you know, he's like trying to figure out what's going on. She explains it to him, and he's thankful. But slowly he starts to realize things are not all there. And he's in a bad situation, mainly because, like I said, things are not all right up in Annie's head. You know, the cheese fell off her cracker a long time ago, as George Carlin would say. She's running on a very lean mixture. There's more than just one screw loose going around there. You shake her head, you'll hear a bunch of rattling. And as I kind of mentioned already, when she reads the last Misery book when he's there, she snaps. And she says, "You're just another dirty birdie. Misery just tanking, I'll be dead." And after leaving for a couple days and not giving him his pain medication, she buys a typewriter and forces him to write a book that will retcon Misery's death. And she is not only just a constant reader, but she's a critic. Like, no. This is well written, but it's not wrong. It's a cheat. You can't just say that he managed to get there when at the end of the last book. He obviously didn't. You gotta start with her in the ground and then go from there. Paul eventually does figure out a way to bring Misery back and goes from there. But things just keep going. He tries to escape. That fails. And of course, there's the famous hobbling scene, which is the reason it was turned into a movie originally. But whereas in the movie, you get the block between the legs and then sledgehammer. In the novel, it's axe to the foot, cauterized with a blowtorch, which hurts as well and would have been good on screen. It might not have had the same appeal as seeing that foot go. And you know, it's a thing we'll never know for certain if that would have been just as unsettling, if not more so. But since there's no blood, MPAA probably isn't going to edit it as much. It goes to a very impactful climax, and I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't read the book. If you've seen the movie and you're watching this, you already know what happens, and it's more or less the same with only a couple minor differences. And the very, very end of the novel is a little different. As I mentioned earlier, there is a little subtext about drug addiction in this book, and that stems from the fact that it is told entirely from Paul Sheldon's perspective. And there is a lot of passages where he's just wandering in his mind, thinking over the writing process, and also thinking about how the Norvell she's given him, it's taken away the pain, but he has a monkey on his shoulder now. It's called addiction, and he has to deal with that. And if you know anything about Stephen King in the 80s, you know this is the time where he was dealing with alcohol and drug addiction. So there's a lot of that in here. He's exercising his demons, to use the old phrase. And like I said before, it's not really something you could really fully convey on screen without it being a little distracting. Like I said, it's subtext in the movie, but in the novel, since it's a medium where you're just typing away, it's all there. And it's something that I think I missed the first time I read it about 10 years ago, or maybe it's just something I forgot in the years since. But watching it again, it makes me appreciate the book even more. And without having read all of his books yet, I'd say that this and The Shining are probably his two most personal ones. Now, of course, with The Shining, if you've actually read the book, you know why, because the character of Jack Torrance is essentially King, or at least, you know, the dealing with the alcohol problem, whereas here, it's in a different way. And there's also another, and it also is represented in this book in another way, and that is Annie having Paul separated from society while he's addicted to Norville at her doing represents the isolation that addiction gives you. That even if you're surrounded by people, you're really alone because of your addiction, especially when people confront you with it, kind of like how Annie confronts Paul about the book. And at first you don't want to believe it, and then you become dependent on it, which sums up the whole relationship the two have. And of course you also see some abusive relationship stuff thrown in there, mainly because a couple times Paul notes stuff like he doesn't want to say anything that'll set her off, or when he does, he's like, "Oh crap, no baby, please don't hurt me, I didn't mean it." He doesn't say it like that, but that's it. And I also find it a little funny that there's one little thing that Paul contemplates in the book that he doesn't try, but he thinks, yeah, that would only work in the movie, and that's the whole thing about using the Norville to incapacitate Annie. The funny thing about that is he actually does try that in the movie, and it fails because she drops the wine glass. I wonder if the writers, when they were reading the novel, tried to figure out how to construct a screenplay, if they're like, let's do that. Let's throw that in there as a little in-joke for the in joke for the fans of the book. And of course, there's one thing from the movie that Paul didn't do that I have a feeling if he did, Annie probably would have said something, and that is, "Hi, honey." He doesn't do that. Which, that's still one of my favorite little moments from the movie, but he doesn't do that. He does other stuff similar to that, but he doesn't do that. Now, if you are looking to get into Stephen King books, this is one I recommend you start with. It definitely would easily make my top 10 list of Stephen King books. And obviously comes with my high recommendation. Now note, there are a couple parts where there's a long break in between the main actions of the book where Paul's contemplating a lot of stuff, which for some people might turn you off a little bit, but me, I really did enjoy it, especially since I saw how much of King's soul is actually poured out into this book. And when people say they don't like King as a writer, which for those of you who are fans of King like me, there are those, I would recommend that they give this book a read and then call me in the morning